Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang, currently sheltering in place in San Francisco. Markets rallied today. The Dow, S&P, and the Nasdaq all ending the day up. This amidst a stream of continually dismal data, but a rising belief that the economy may reopen sooner than expected, even if it happens state by state. We're currently waiting now for the president's daily briefing at the White House. The president tweeting earlier today, calling on liberating the states, and even some states already taking measures, Minnesota and Texas, to ease restrictions. I want to get a lay of what this means for the tech economy, the big tech giants. Joining us now, our own Tom Giles, our editor in San Francisco. Tom, the president is planning a phasing reopening of the economy, but this, of course, depends on what governors want to do. For states like California and Washington, where most of big tech is based, what does that mean if we believe that those states will likely be farther behind?
The thing that you have to remember about the big tech companies that are located in those two states is that in terms of keeping operations going, in terms of employees showing up to work, getting their, working on their projects, delivering software, we've seen these companies in these states have actually been performing fairly well. And by that I mean, if you're an engineer working at Google, if you're in the main office at Amazon, those people are able to do their jobs by and large from home. And so there hasn't been the same kind of disruption that you've seen. Now, as you get into the physical space, like the people who are in the Amazon warehouses doing the deliveries, the people who are working Apple stores, for example, that's where you've seen it hit a lot harder. So in the sense of, people who are out in the physical economy, when you get back to work, it's going to, as you come back, as you kind of get the economy going, people go back to stores. That's going to make a real difference for people like Apple.
Meantime, Tom, here in San Francisco, we're now hearing that officials are going to require folks to wear face masks when they go out in public. I mean, this is certainly, a rapidly evolving situation, and clearly the authorities in San Francisco think it's a very dangerous situation. Walk us through company by company. You have a company like Google, for example, and Facebook, both based in the Bay Area, that depend on advertising. Google already saying they're going to be slowing hiring through the end of the year. We wonder what Facebook is going to do. But if a company as healthy as Google is making these tough decisions, we can assume that things are going to be tight, even for the healthiest companies in the world. What are you looking forward to when it comes to their corporate earnings?
So Google and Facebook are a great example of companies that are going to have a big impact when it comes to advertising revenue. So you're seeing a lot of people are using Google, a lot of people are using Facebook to stay in touch, to communicate with each other. There's been a surge in demand for information, for example, on YouTube, this big property of Google. On the other hand, the businesses that advertise, and remember, advertising is the lion's share of both of these companies' revenue base, those businesses have really pulled back. We've been reporting on how company after company is really slashing their marketing budget, their advertising budgets, and that hurts Google and Facebook in a fundamental way. So on the one hand, you've seen this surge in demand for Google and Facebook products, especially as concerns the delivery of information, the delivery of news, and helping people stay in touch with each other, which we all so desperately want when we're sheltering in place. On the other hand, if businesses aren't advertising, that's going to really hurt their revenue, both of those companies. So we're going to be looking very, very closely at the revenue side of things and the advertising, which we think is going to take a hit.
All right, our own Tom Giles digging deep there. Of course, we're going to be covering all of these tech earnings as they roll out over the next few weeks, from Facebook to Google to Amazon and Apple. Coming up, we are going to bring you my exclusive conversation with Instagram co-founder Kevin Systrom. He has been doing detailed modeling of the coronavirus outbreak, and today is launching a new website that will focus on U.S. infections and update that live. We'll be right back with my conversation with Kevin Systrom next. This is Bloomberg. Turning now to the photo sharing app Instagram, whose growth has soared over the last several years. Kevin Systrom, the co-founder, sold the company to Facebook back in 2012 for $1 billion. He left in 2018, and now he's on to his next act, modeling the coronavirus. Today, he launched a new website that will update U.S. infection rates live. Take a listen to my exclusive conversation with Instagram co-founder Kevin Systrom earlier today.
The whole idea here is that there's this number called the effective reproduction rate. And it basically means how many people get infected per person who is currently infected. If that number is less than 1, then the infection's under control. If it's over 1, it means that it's growing out of control. So we're trying to take what is a complex topic and boil it down to a simple number that anyone can view from their home just by visiting rt.live. And that's our hope, is to make it simple for everyone.
Instagram's growth was the epitome of viral in the online sense. What are you applying here that you learned from Instagram? Obviously, you have some unique insights into how we all socialize, and how does that apply to the model that we're seeing?
Well, I think there are 2 parts here. First, I want to say this website is simply the productionization, if I could call it that, of a notebook that I published and a model that I published. The idea was just that you could access it without having to press refresh, every day on the model. Separately, the viral growth that I saw at Instagram, I think, compares to the science of viral growth in general. Now, there are vast differences between an actual virus and the growth of a company, but they use similar math. And by using that similar math on this actual virus, you can actually come to some really interesting conclusions, including estimating this number R that we're talking about that explains how fast the virus is growing.
So explain to us Luddites then, how much worse is this going to get? And how much worse will it get before it gets better?
Now, here's the really interesting part about that question, is that you can't answer that question in general. Often you'll try to find people give a very broad summary at the highest level across either the world, across a region or a country, but it turns out that this virus is very local, that Louisiana may be doing far better than Massachusetts, might be doing far better than, I don't know, Maine. You have to ask what's happening locally, and here at this website, rt.live, we're basically breaking that down on a state level so that you can see what's happening around you. So I can't answer specifically when this gets better, but what I can do is give you effectively radar into seeing how it's going currently where you live.
Well, you do get really granular state by state. So let's take New York, for example, and maybe California, because we're both here. And I want to know, if you look at those 2 states, which have had vastly different kinds of outbreaks and different responses, what do you see?
Well, what's super interesting about those 2 states are that, number one, they've gone through a transformation and a lockdown. So you can actually see R used to be something like 2 or 3, meaning for every person that got sick, they would make 2 or 3 other people sick. And that's the reason why a lockdown is so important. And after the lockdown, you see the effective R number come down. And it comes down as we all begin to social distance, as we stop going to school, as we stop going to the workplace, as we stop shaking hands, as we start wearing masks. That the R number comes down. But what's super interesting is as we begin to become a little bit more lax, as we begin to open certain sectors of the economy back up, the question is going to be, what happens to that number? Does it go back above 1? And I think that's why this dashboard is so important, because it gives you a live insight into the effects of the choices we all make. And I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'll be watching the dashboard just as closely as you will.
Now, you correctly predicted that the US would have 10,000 cases by March 19th. Meantime, you also point out you're not an epidemiologist. You have said you're showing this to policymakers. Who have you showed this to? How have they responded? Has anyone from the White House reached out?
Well, I have sent it out broadly, mostly because I hope that people take the concepts largely into the work they're doing, not necessarily the conclusions that I'm making. Because I'm one person and the math that I run is specific on the data that I'm using, and there are a bunch of different sources. But the idea that we can manage our country or a state on this idea of an effective reproduction number, basically, that's the thing that I want people to understand. And if you watched Governor Cuomo's address yesterday, he got deep into the idea of this effective R number and the idea that we can watch R as we start to make changes and as New York starts to open up again. And it can be that gauge that allows us to decide what to do. I don't think anyone sent my blog post or my model to Angela Merkel or her team, but she spent all of yesterday talking about the effective reproduction number as well. My whole goal is to build a vernacular around this concept of R, and to have us realize that I believe, and I truly believe this, that it's the most effective way to manage coming out of this lockdown and manage the virus going forward.
Now, as you say, we're trying to balance economic prosperity with public safety. And you have President Trump outlining his plans to reopen the economy. You have some governors pushing back, saying it's too soon, and others who say we need this now because the economic impact has been so dire. If you could say one thing to President Trump about how to manage this reopening, what would that be?
Well, I think that it's customized, that you have to look locally and you have to give power to local government because the local government understands their current situation. And if you look what he and his team have done, they've basically done that. They've said, we realize that this infection and that this virus is a local epidemic as much as it is a global pandemic. And all of us have varying needs and all of us have varying levels of infection. So to give one medicine to every patient doesn't make sense. Instead, what we need to do is give customized guidelines and a framework to each local government and allow them to follow the best practices. And I think that's what they've done. And I think that's correct.
Is there something that scares you most about this in terms of people feeling or not being concerned enough or not being careful enough?
At the beginning, at the beginning, I felt strongly that people weren't concerned enough. And very quickly after California shut down, all the other states started following suit. And then I had a sigh of relief because I knew people were taking it seriously. That doesn't mean we're out of the woods. And the concern that I have now is that people think we're past, quote unquote, the peak. And all the models that you read are just as complicated, if not more complicated than mine, and rely on a bunch of assumptions. And no one really understands where we are. So instead of trying to predict the future, what we're trying to do at RT.live is understand where we currently are. Because the second we start opening up, it might go well, but it might not. And depending on where you live and the type of industry you're in, it could go a bunch of different directions. So the most important thing we can do is effectively have this radar, right? To know where we're headed and what's in front of us. And that's what we're trying to do at RT.live.
Kevin Systrom there, co-founder of Instagram. More of that conversation coming up later in the show. We talk a little bit about what he thinks of Instagram today, how he thinks Facebook is handling the coronavirus crisis, as well as his relationship with Mark Zuckerberg. Meantime, up next, some tech companies have found ways to conserve cash while keeping employees employed and happy. We're going to speak to our own Shelly Banjo coming up. This is Bloomberg. As the tech industry reels and uncertainty mounts, some tech startups have found ways to conserve cash and keep their employees happy. That comes with offering stock instead of an increase in salary or much salary at all. Joining us now to discuss, Bloomberg's Shelly Banjo, who's been looking into this. Shelly, You profile a company called Metal.tv, which is a gaming startup where activity is actually booming because we're all shut in right now. But even these employees have had to take pay cuts and they're getting offered equity instead. Tell us a little bit more.
Sure. So this is one of the companies that has actually been doing well during the coronavirus outbreak as people are staying at home and gaming more. But they were in the middle of raising their Series B round of funding, and they said, you know what, we don't know when that's ever going to happen because as VCs and others have warned, funding is likely to dry up as people are kind of worried about the risk out there. And so the co-founder that I spoke to said, we need to conserve cash so that we can have a runway for the next 18 to 24 months. And the way they did that was they asked everybody if they wanted to take a salary decrease, a pay cut, and in return, stock units, which will vest over the next year.
So tell us a little bit more about how broadly you anticipate this will be. We're hearing from investors, we're hearing from operators that the advice that companies are being given is if you have to lay off people, if you have to make cuts, do it now and cut deeper than you think you will need to cut so that this isn't death by 1,000 cuts. Do you think that we're going to see a lot more companies employing this strategy?
I think it's right. I mean, there is not a day that's gone by over the last 2 weeks that a startup has not announced layoffs. There's this layoff tracker even that's popped up that's already tracked 24,000 startup jobs that have been cut. And so that's certainly the easiest, fastest, and most direct way to conserve cash. What these founders are trying to do is to say, you know what, we really believe in our business, and if our employees do too, let's see if we can kind of offer them a slice of the future earnings by cutting back their salary now. And it's a way to really avoid that pain of the layoff. But as you're alluding to, you know, it's a big if. And when I spoke to these folks, they're like, well, you know, if everything goes well, well, you know, what if everything doesn't go well? And then these employees, you know, will end up hurt in financially.
Right, of course, there's a big downside. I mean, if these companies don't do well, as to be honest, most startups don't do as well as they might expect, then what happens? Then you've got even more people who are out on the sidewalk.
That's exactly right. You're basically saying to them, you know, take less pay and hope for the best. And so, like one of the founders said to me, this only works for an employee who really believes in the company and really believes in the future. So maybe at a company like a gaming company that's actually done really well and is growing users quickly, it makes sense. For others whose business, you know, might be wholly wiped out during this type of coronavirus outbreak, that it might not bode as well. But there's certainly VCs that I spoke to who said, you know, try everything else first. Try cutting your rent, try cutting back on contracts and software, you know, and then layoffs because, you know, you don't really need to, in this kind of environment, their thinking goes, you don't actually need to persuade people to keep their jobs. Like if they have a job and they're getting a paycheck and health insurance, these days it's a pretty good deal.
Now, Shelley, you've moved back to the U.S. after covering the Chinese tech scene for a really long time, and I'm curious what you're seeing out there. How are they coming out of this outbreak? What does the tech economy look like? Is it significantly weaker or not?
I think it's really varied across the different ecosystems. So VC funding has completely evaporated. I mean, while it's holding steady in the U.S. so far, funding for new companies in China, new venture capital firms raising funding has also really dropped. So that tells you a little bit about the pipeline that's coming up. For the big companies like Alibaba and Tencent, you know, some of them have been able to actually expand their reach and consolidate their power. You saw Meituan, which is a big food delivery company, really expand its sales and customer base because as China was shut down, restaurants were shut down, these people still kept going and delivering their food. And so I really expect the same thing to happen in the U.S. when you see companies like Amazon that are, you know, seem to be gaining power and gaining spread through all of this, which is exactly what has happened with Alibaba and Tencent and Meituan. The bigger companies have actually seemed to have gained coming out of this.
Is there anything that Silicon Valley can learn from the Chinese tech scene and how they have weathered this?
I think a really interesting thing that we are seeing in already in the U.S. is that the big Chinese tech companies like Alibaba and Tencent definitely rose to this idea that, everybody is reliant on us right now. Video conferencing, workplace, cloud services, those kinds of things really help the companies, all sorts of companies, stay alive. And, obviously we're seeing some of that happen in the U.S. as well. And so I think this idea of, continue to provide things that will, use this as an opportunity to show new customers what services you do have to offer, and, maybe they'll stick with you when things open up.
All right, Bloomberg's Shelley Bandro reporting for us. Thanks, Shelley, for bringing us those insights there. Coming up, more of my exclusive conversation with Instagram co-founder Kevin Systrom. He's, of course, been tracking the coronavirus, the outbreak, especially across the United States. We also got his thoughts on Instagram today, how the company and how Facebook are battling coronavirus misinformation on the site, as well as his relationship with Mark Zuckerberg after he abruptly left the company in 2018. Also, we will take you to the White House. We are monitoring the White House press briefing scheduled to start at the top of the hour. We will have headlines on the Bloomberg as that begins. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. We turn back now to my exclusive conversation with Instagram co-founder and former CEO Kevin Systrom, who left the company abruptly in 2018. We talk about the state of his relationship with Mark Zuckerberg. We talk about why he hasn't posted on Instagram in almost 2 years. We also talk about how he believes Facebook is handling misinformation about the coronavirus and more. Take a listen.
Knowing the people that work there, I think everyone has the best of intentions. And if you could have planned for this and created a contingency plan for a global pandemic that would shut your business down, I think that would have been great. But I mean, let's be honest, very, very few businesses, if any, did. And what we're seeing now are the effects of effectively a very fat-tailed event, a very, very rare event. So I don't put the blame or onus on any one of these tech companies for not having seen this, because it's just such a rare event. The question is how you respond to it. And I think what you're beginning to see is that leaders like Mark and others have stepped up, and not only are they going live with doctors from the CDC, they're trying to get the word out, and I think they're setting great examples with their employees by keeping them home right now in this time. So while it is challenging and the response has been variable, I think that they're doing their best, and I think we'll see that they continue to try to do that going forward.
That said, you left Facebook in 2018, and I think it was pretty clear back then that you weren't pleased about how Mark Zuckerberg was running things. Zooming out a little bit, misinformation is one thing, redirecting folks from Instagram back to Facebook. What are your biggest concerns about Instagram's future right now? This is your baby. This is your creation.
Yeah, first I'll say that like the team that runs it now, I think they've been doing their best to grow what is a fantastic platform. And you're right, it is my baby, and Mike, my co-founder, feels exactly the same way. But like how proud we feel when we go on Instagram during a crisis like this, and you see people that aren't able to connect physically connecting digitally. You look at John Krasinski's Some Good News, and you see the way he's sharing some positive news during all of this to his followers and fans. You see people, artists going live, whether it's DJs or musicians, and serenading their fans in a moment of darkness. Like the creativity that comes out online on a platform like Instagram is really inspiring. And whether I run it or not is a completely separate question, but I'm very proud, as a parent from afar, seeing what the platform's become and seeing how people use it.
My colleague Sarah Fryer just came out with a book about Instagram called No Filter, and her conclusion is that Facebook is underinvesting in Instagram specific problems. I wonder if you agree with that, and if so, does that concern you about whether Instagram's growth will falter? I mean, Instagram for investors is one of the great hopes of Facebook's overall growth. Should they be concerned that Instagram won't grow like it did?
Well, I haven't read the book. I did live the history, right? And I saw places where I think we invested appropriately and places where I wish we had invested more. But the truth of it is that we grew the platform to over 1 billion people, and you don't do that with nobody, and you don't do that with no resources. That being said, I don't know what's happening on the inside, and for me to speculate what investments have or have not been made is very difficult to do from the outside. But if I were in charge of Facebook and I saw something like Instagram, I'd obviously invest a lot in it to make sure that it becomes another pillar of the many products that we have as a company. And I think that's just the logical argument to make and the logical thing to do. And I think Mark's a very logical person, and hopefully he's following that.
Have you had any contact with him since you left? I mean, what's your relationship like now?
Yeah, we've seen each other a handful of times. It's amicable, I think. But the most important thing to keep here in mind is that Silicon Valley is a really small place, and we're all very, very young. I mean, I'm 36, and my career doesn't end, last year or the year before. We're going to be around for a while, and we're going to be crossing paths. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind as you build relationships going forward.
That said, and I know we don't want to get into the palace intrigue here, but you haven't used Instagram since May of 2018.
Oh, no, that's not
Why
true
not?
at all. That's not true at all. Posting is very different than using. It's the first thing I check when I get up in the morning. I wouldn't know about the examples I just gave you about how Instagram's being used if I didn't check it incessantly.
So you haven't posted, I should rephrase.
Yeah, and actually, to be fair, over the last 2 weeks, I have posted a bunch in my story about the work I've been doing with modeling. Part of this is a personal choice of deciding that when you leave something to, leave quietly and go have some introspective time on what matters to you. And part of it is just, wanting some privacy every now and then. But when I have something to say and something to share, I get really excited. And that's why I've been posting a lot about the work I've been doing recently. And I think you'll see that with RT.live. I think we'll probably be posting charts and updates and using Instagram what it's meant for, which is to give people a visual voice. And I'll make sure to do that as well.
So how has this pandemic, has it at all changed your plans for what's next? Your next act as an entrepreneur?
I think a lot about this question, mostly because I think everyone likes to plan life out. They like to have their 1, 3, or 5 year plan, or maybe people who are type A like me like to do that, right? And you never really know what curveballs are going to get thrown and how you're going to react. Now, I don't know how this, parlays into the next chapter, but what I do know is the technology that I'm using, whether it's machine learning or just general data science, will inform anything that I do in the future. And the only reason I got into this in the first place was because I had a passion for data science and for machine learning, and I wanted to apply that to problems that mattered to people. And I think that's what we've done with RT.live. And I think we'll see where it goes. I don't expect RT.live to become a company. I don't expect to be the CEO of it. But I wanted to have a resource that people could go to see what was happening in their communities in real time. And I feel like my talent or my skills were just best used in that way in this moment. And I hope it was for the better.
More broadly, Google has announced a hiring slowdown through the rest of the year. It's clear that the economy is going to take a massive hit from this. Do you think there's going to be a big impact on the Silicon Valley and tech economy if even a company as healthy, historically healthy like Google, is making these tough decisions?
Well, Google, remember, lived through the global financial crisis in 08, 09. I was there. I worked there, and I saw, everything from hiring freezes. I was working on the corporate development team. We stopped buying companies. the free snacks started to be different. As much as I joke, they took it very seriously at the time, and I think they learned a bunch of lessons. So I think companies that haven't gone through this type of thing, this type of disruption economically,
Many startups.
many startups are learning for the first time. But what's super interesting is we actually have a bunch of leaders who have gone through this before, and I think they're posting about their lessons having led through a crisis like this before. And hopefully, young leaders who are starting companies today will avoid those mistakes. But there's no way any company can avoid, the issues that we're having right now. It turns out everyone who buys advertising runs a normal business that sells things to normal consumers, and if you have advertising, you can't escape the cycle of the lack of income and the lack of jobs and the lack of spending that will eventually influence advertising spending. Now, some will come out, I think, more ahead than others, depending on how useful the advertising they provide is. But that remains to be seen, and I guess we'll just have to see.
And is that going to be tough on Google, Facebook, and Instagram? I mean, these are advertising-driven businesses.
I think there's the short run and then there's the long run. In the short run, of course, it's got to be painful in terms of revenue. But these companies make a fair amount of margin. They have tons of cash lying around. This isn't like these companies are going to go bankrupt tomorrow and you won't see them ever again. That's not true for all companies, by the way, but the ones you're asking about specifically have an enormous amount, stockpile of cash sitting around, and I think they'll weather the storm. And in the long run, hopefully this kind of pressure makes all of these companies better because they have to deliver even more on the promise the promise that they give effective advertising to businesses. So again, I think we'll have to see.
My exclusive interview there with Kevin Systrom, the co-founder and former CEO of Instagram. Coming up, we're talking about online talk therapy. All of this sheltering in place has some people feeling really isolated. We're going to talk to the founder and CEO of Talkspace, a company that's trying to help. Coming up, this is Bloomberg. The toll that quarantines, social distancing, and self-isolation can be immense, and not everybody is able to get out or afford the therapy that they need. Recently, there's been a growing surge in online therapy. One company working on this is Talkspace. Joining us now, the co-founder and head of clinical services for Talkspace, Ronnie Frank. And Ronnie, I just want to clarify, it's your husband that's the CEO. Thank you so much for joining us. Talk to us a little bit about the kind of activity you've seen. Have you seen a surge in activity on the site, and how so?
Hi, and thank you for having me. So I'd like to share first what we see on the platform in the last few weeks as a quick overview. As we're dealing with this global devastating pandemic, anxiety and fear have heightened dramatically in the last few weeks. At Talkspace, we see a spike of 65% in demand. We also see a spike in supply. We're getting 5 times more therapist applications a day as therapists cannot see clients in person and as a result are looking for remote care solutions. Our therapist network of over 5,000 licensed therapists share that they have never seen such an overwhelming level of anxiety and fear before, and it's getting worse almost by the day. In terms of what our clients are dealing with right now, many of our clients are extremely anxious about losing their job, or they already lost their job. Financial insecurity causes significant distress and, of course, leads to severe anxiety symptoms. Another big topic that therapists see is loneliness. In the U.S., 35 million people live alone. So naturally, lockdowns and social distancing leads not only to isolation and depression, but also there is a lot of fear about what's going to happen to me if I get sick and no one can help me. We also see a lot of people that either they or their loved ones suffer. Hello?
Yes, Ronnie, I can still hear you.
Hello?
Michael Phelps, some of our viewers some of our viewers might be familiar with your commercials. Michael Phelps is actually one of your spokespeople. When you talk about the surge in activity, is there any particular kind of person who is utilizing these services more? I know initially you saw women using the service more.
So as the leader of this space, we're doubling down on our mission and we're offering additional mental health services. We have launched a donation program recently for healthcare workers on the front lines because we started seeing a spike in healthcare professionals who need help as they're dealing with so much burnout and pain during these times. So we are donating 1,000 months of free therapy for those medical workers across the country as they desperately need emotional support. Michael Phelps, who's our partner, joined this program as well and added 500 additional months of free therapy. And our network of therapists is joining with 300 months of donations that are matched by the company. And it's a beautiful thing to see how everyone is stepping up and contributing to the greater good. We are also offering free support groups on Facebook.
No, Ronnie, it's such an important issue, and I'm so glad to hear about all of the work that you're doing, because even some folks who don't have mental health issues normally are probably going a little crazy right now. Do you think that this could be the moment for telehealth? I mean, you know, obviously it can be a difficult proposition. Some people can't afford it. Do you think that this is the moment that these kinds of services take off and then last beyond the pandemic?
So as people are turning to remote care solutions because private practices shut down, they are realizing the advantages of digital mental health. They see that not only is it safe, but it's also more affordable, more convenient, and at the same time, they're receiving quality care. So it would make no sense for people to go back to expensive, inconvenient traditional services. And that's why this is a game changer for telehealth. It's changing consumer behavior forever.
Okay. Ronnie Frank, co-founder of Talkspace. Ronnie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us. Coming up, we're going to talk about the challenges of hiring in the COVID-19 era. We're seeing layoffs after layoffs, hiring freezes. We'll be speaking with Jana Rich of Rich Talent Group, who has some experience with this. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg. Unemployment lines are long, even in this age of social distancing. 22 million Americans filing for unemployment in just the last 4 weeks. That is a decade worth of job growth just gone. Joining me now, Rich Talent Group founder Jana Rich, who's been working in Silicon Valley in recruiting and hiring for a very long time. Jana, I'm so glad to have you with us. And I want to start with Google, which hasn't instituted an official hiring freeze per se, but they have said they are slowing hiring now through the end of the year. How significant is it that a company as healthy as Google is even having these kinds of issues?
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here. What I would say is somewhat surprising is you look at Google, honestly, and think of it as a very diversified and healthy company who seemingly is one of those positioned to do well in a period of time like this. And at least what I've heard is some of the slowdown in hiring is their concern about onboarding people. So it's interesting to hear that part of the attribution was because of that, because other companies have certainly embraced the idea that we are going to hire, we are going to bring people on remotely. And it's interesting just that, I think Google has at least expressed some concern that they're going to slow down hiring partially because of that fact.
So then how much more broadly do you think we're going to see layoffs and hiring freezes across Silicon Valley? I mean, it seems like almost everybody has been told to tighten their belts and to make cuts now that might be deeper than you need to make, so you don't have to do this more than once.
It's a good question. I certainly don't think, to be honest, that we've seen the end of this yet, unfortunately, because I do think there's a lot of companies that are still doing scenario planning. It doesn't mean to say that they haven't cut deeply enough. They may not even have cut yet, right? There are definitely companies who have looked at, what are the next couple of months going to be like? I agree with you. I think they're going to make tough decisions, potentially deeper cuts so that they don't have to do numerous different downsizings, but I don't think we've seen them all yet. I think there's a lot that have already done so, but some are still going to be in that boat.
So you have Facebook and Google that are probably going to be suffering from some kind of ad slump. You've got Tim Cook saying Apple will bounce back from this just like they did in the 90s. You've got Amazon struggling with warehouse issues and just getting people the things that they need. I'm curious if you see any bright spots. Where do you see hiring happen? I mean, even companies that have been doing well, like Zoom Video, Blue Apron, Slack, you're seeing some of these companies pull back as we talk about reopening the economy, and folks think, well, maybe folks aren't going to be using those as much now.
I think there's a lot of different areas, actually, where there's some interesting and maybe even slightly unexpected growth. So I'll give you a couple examples, one of which is gaming. So you're finding that a lot of people are engaging with gaming companies in deeper, broader, more frequent ways than they have in the past. And you even see certain gaming companies starting to morph their model. So, for example, there's a gaming company down in LA. It's called Wave, W-A-V-E. And this is all around sort of virtual concerts. So they're moving into a whole new arena that is very exciting. This whole concept that you could have the artist in studio somewhere where the sound quality is magnificent, but the audience is actually virtual. So I think gaming is one space in which there's some really interesting moves that are happening. The other, which I don't think has been spoken about a lot, but is very large legacy companies that need to be even stronger in the digital delivery of their service offering. So we're working, for example, with one very large CPG company, one very large financial services company, both of them saying, we need a head of digital reporting directly to the CEO who's going to help us transform our businesses really quickly to be able to adjust to a world in which so much more is remote than it ever was before.
So you've gone through the hiring and recruiting process in the financial crisis, through the dot-com bust, through 9/11. How do you think this will compare? Is this significantly worse?
So the two downturns that I've seen, the difference in both of those from my perspective, and it's a pretty big one, is there was never an issue of people's personal physical health and safety. And so it comes with it a whole different level of, seriousness, severity, concern. I also think this is extremely broad-based. I think it hits almost all industry segments realistically, whereas the dot-com bust was almost exactly as the title implies. It was heavily weighted towards tech. In 2008, the downturn was least impacted by tech and almost everywhere else more so. And I think this one truly will be across the board. So I do think this will be more serious than the two other downturns that have happened in the last 20 years.
All right, Jana Rich. Jana, really appreciate you joining us. Obviously, there's so much going on. Jana Rich, founder of Rich Talent Group, there with some fascinating insight across Silicon Valley. We are still standing by for that White House briefing to begin. You can check out the Bloomberg for headlines from that. You can watch it on Live Go, expecting some more details today on the president's reopening plans, what that might mean state by state. He was tweeting earlier today about states needing to be liberated to do as they wish as they reopen. We're already seeing states like Texas and Minnesota starting to ease their restrictions. Looking at a live look at the podium there. Tune into the Bloomberg if you want to watch. This is Bloomberg, and that's it for Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.